president of Secular Student Alliance. And once again, thank you for coming out. Our speaker tonight, as you know, is Mr. Adam Lee. He was born and raised and still living in New York City, New York. He has been quoted by the renowned biologist Mr. Richard Dawkins in his best-selling book, The God Delusion. In his free time, he writes for his Patheos blog entitled Daylight Atheism. His works for Daylight Atheism include Saffron Fascism, The Crushing Burden of Religious Sex Guilt, and Whom Do the Police Serve, and many, many, many more wonderful articles. And here's Joel.
He was quoted by Richard Dawkins, but he also... Sorry. He also has a really good piece in The Guardian on Richard Dawkins and misogyny in the secular movement that I recommend people read. And I also want to remind everyone that this is brought to you by the Secular Student Alliance in association with the Philosophy Club. So if you guys want to, after the talk, sign up and get on our mailing list, we can email you about upcoming events. But yeah, we'd like to present you Mr. Elton.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for everyone at SSA for inviting me here. And thank you Joel and Shelby for that introduction. And as you gathered tonight, I am going to be talking about the science of morality, also known as secular morality in the modern age. So, this worked before. There we go. Sir Thomas More's novel, Utopia, written in 1516, gave us our word for an imaginary perfect society. More's Utopia was a socialist welfare state with free hospitals, no war, no unemployment, and no locks on the doors. Even though More was a Catholic, he permitted both divorce and euthanasia there, and he made it clear that Utopia tolerates people of any religious belief, whether they worship the sun, the moon, or their own ancestors. In an era when every nation had its own established state church and harsh penalties for unorthodoxy, this makes the novel even more impressively ahead of its time. But there was one exception to the rule of tolerance in Utopia. More's ideal state had a solemn and severe law against those who think that the world was governed by chance, without a wise overruling providence. The Utopians never raised any that hold these maxims, either to honors or offices, nor employ them in any trust, but despised them as men of base and sordid minds. After all, as the author explained, if there were people who didn't believe in punishment after death, there'd be nothing to stop them breaking the law whenever they thought they could get away with it. But of course, that was in the 16th century. Surely opinions have changed since then, right? A Gallup poll last year asked Americans if they'd be more or less willing to vote for a presidential candidate who is, take your pick, evangelical, Catholic, Jewish, Hispanic, a woman, a gay person, a pot smoker, an atheist, and so on. Most of these characteristics, as you can see, made little or no difference. But the least popular category, by far, was the non-believer. A full 53% of Americans, an absolute majority, said that they'd be less likely to vote for one of us. Even for a gay candidate, only 27% said the same. It's not just in the political arena where people are prejudiced against us. Another poll from a few years ago asked Americans which group was least likely to, quote, share their vision of American society. Again, atheists came out on the bottom, ranking below recent immigrants, gays, and Muslims. People are prejudiced against atheists because, like Thomas More, they believe we're immoral and untrustworthy. And this belief has real-world repercussions. It matters when people won't vote for us, don't want to date us, don't want their sons or daughters to marry us. It matters when courts favor religious parents over atheist parents in granting child custody. And it matters when bus companies and billboard companies refuse to accept our ads, even ones like these with messages as simple as, if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. It matters when charities turn down our donations for no good reason. As the American Cancer Society did several years ago, with a potential $500,000 donation from the atheist philanthropist Todd Stiefel and the secular charity Foundation Beyond Belief. If we're going to fight back against these harmful prejudices, we need to show, by argument and example, that atheists can be good people too. The question is, what does it mean to be a good person? Or in other words, what does it mean to be moral? Through the ages, people have proposed countless different answers to this question. But the one thing most of them have in common is that their belief that the only possible source of morality is religion. For centuries, each new generation has been brought up to believe that the only way to know the difference between right and wrong is by obeying the orthodox interpretation of their own preferred holy book. Today, the atheist movement is gaining numbers and becoming more visible. And there's no indication that atheists as a whole are any less moral than believers, but still this prejudice lingers. Religious apologists insist that, without the threat of divine retribution, atheism provides no basis for morality. If there's no punishment after death, they ask, why be a good person? Why not just do whatever you want? While I disagree completely with the idea that atheists have no foundation for morality, it is a valid question to ask where we get that foundation. What encourages us to do right, if not the promise of a heaven? What keeps us from doing wrong, if not the threat of a hell? The first and most obvious answer people have proposed to this question is that there is no moral foundation and no real right or wrong, that people have different preferences, but none are better or worse than any others in any objective sense. This view is usually called moral relativism, the idea that morality is entirely relative to who you ask. This view has it right insofar as morality clearly isn't a thing that exists independently of us. There's no law of physics corresponding to morality, no elementary particle of good or evil. Morality, if it can be defined at all, can only be defined with reference to the desires and goals of intelligent beings. However, just because two people disagree, it doesn't mean there's no fact of the matter. It doesn't mean that neither of them is right or wrong. And if you're trying to decide who's right and who's wrong in a moral argument, first you need to know the underlying principle that they're disagreeing about how best to realize. When we talk about how to create the best possible society or treat others in the best possible way, what are we really talking about? In other words, what's the ultimate aim of morality? Different moral systems have a variety of answers to this question. Some of the answers you might hear, depending on who you ask, are freedom, justice, human rights, reverence for one's elders, religious faith, or societal stability. But I find that these answers are too arbitrary. For each of them, we can ask why. Why should that be the foundation of morality and not something else? Why should I value that quality and not its opposite? Granted, there can't be an infinite regression of reasons. Any chain of explanations has to stop somewhere. However, we shouldn't stop sooner than we have to. If our moral system isn't going to be completely arbitrary and ungrounded, we should keep asking why as long as the question can be meaningfully answered. And if you do this, I think there's only one ultimate answer you'll arrive at, one quality that needs no further justification for why we seek it. That quality is happiness. All people want to be happy, and everything else which we desire is ultimately just a means to that end. In the entire universe of human experience, happiness is the only quality we value for its own sake, and not because it will cause or bring about something else that we value. To put it another way, it's the only thing that's good intrinsically and not just instrumentally. Even religious people agree with this, though they may not all realize it. Most of them would say that morality consists of obeying God's commands, avoiding sin, keeping ourselves pure. But why should we care about any of those things? There's only one answer they can give, because they believe that if they do, God will reward them with a happy afterlife. And if they don't, God will punish them with an afterlife of eternal unhappiness and suffering. While I was looking for stock footage to illustrate this slide, I found this picture on the stock photo site. I don't know why there are cows outside the pearly gates, but there are. So, if we choose happiness as the basis for our moral system, the next question that arises is, whose happiness? Mine? Yours? Should we care about some people's happiness more than others, or more than our own? And if so, why? Well, one thing we know is that human beings are social creatures, adapted by evolution to living in groups. There are cells in the brain called mirror neurons, which fire both when you perform an action and when you see someone else performing that same action. You can see here, if you stick your tongue out at a baby monkey, he'll stick his tongue out at you. That's what mirror neurons do. This is what gives rise to our innate sense of empathy, our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, as well as the related phenomenon of emotional contagion, the idea that, for better or for worse, other people's moods and attitudes affect yours. Because we're social creatures, I believe it's impossible to find lasting happiness thinking only of yourself. Happiness comes from meaningful relationships with others, from cultivating social interactions where everyone benefits. Another way to put this is to ask which kind of world you would rather live in. A world where everyone you meet is a rival and an enemy, where everyone is constantly trying to tear down and undermine everyone else, or a world where people are more inclined to work together, to be generous to each other, and to cooperate. If you'd rather live in the second world, as I would, as I'm sure most people would, then I suggest you should do what's in your power to make the real world more like that. Taking universal happiness as the goal ought to give us some idea, not just of how to act in our day-to-day interactions with others, but how to organize society as a whole. Obviously, human beings find happiness in a wide variety of pursuits, and a society that values this would allow them the greatest possible freedom to pursue their own goals. But there are also basic principles, moral universals that improve everyone's lives, principles like fairness, justice, and equality under the law that lead to the most potential happiness if consistently followed by everyone. We refer to these principles as human rights and enshrine them into laws that can't easily be changed. As the American founding father Thomas Paine wrote in 1790, "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression, for if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will lead to himself." The philosopher John Rawls, in his book A Theory of Justice, proposed a similar idea he calls the veil of ignorance. As a thought experiment, he invites people to design a society, its rules and its institutions, without knowing in advance where they'll end up in it. If you might be the poorest and most disadvantaged member of society, then it pays to make sure that even the poorest and most disadvantaged member of society isn't treated too badly. This is true of the real world in the sense that none of us can choose the time and place of our birth. And even if we're born into privilege, the knowledge that it could have been otherwise should inspire us to support justice for those who aren't. Most of all, a moral concern for universal happiness would give people a badly needed dose of long-term perspective. After all, barring extraordinary circumstances, we know that there will be many future generations, each of which will inherit the earth in turn. It would be wrong of us to plunder the world in ways that contribute briefly to our short-term happiness while detracting from our descendants' opportunity to have good lives. So, in addition to compassion and empathy in our day-to-day interactions, in addition to a society organized around liberty, justice, and human rights, taking happiness as our moral compass should give us reason to value the human race as a whole, present and future. And that, in turn, should lead us to value a sustainable and enduring society, one that weighs how its actions affect even those people who haven't yet come into existence. Now, I don't expect to persuade everyone of this. I freely admit that if someone is dead set against this moral system, if they don't value happiness, or if they don't think you can ever know how best to bring it about, then there's nothing I can say to convince them. But the same is true of every system of thought ever invented by human beings. All of them are based on foundational principles that a stubborn person can reject. For example, if someone doesn't believe in the principle of induction, which says that you can learn about the future by studying the past, then no one can convince them to accept the authority of science. The only reason you can give such a person is a practical one. As Stephen Hawking said, science wins because it works. By following the scientific method, we gain a greater understanding of the world and an increased ability to shape it to our desires. I'm proposing that moral ideas should be tested in exactly the same way. Try it out and see if you don't agree that it produces a better life. In short, I'm proposing that morality should be thought of as the science of human happiness, in the same way that medicine is the science of curing people from disease and injury. Morality is an endeavor similar to medicine, but with a broader goal, not just fixing what's wrong, but actively seeking out the best ways to improve human lives. This is my atheist view of morality, and I can say with confidence that it's not in any way borrowed from or based on religious beliefs, because the religious view of morality is completely different. In all but the most liberal religious traditions, being moral means one thing and one thing only: pleasing God by following his commands, regardless of whether that has a positive or a negative effect on the well-being of our fellow humans. The first problem for this ethical system is obvious. Even assuming there is a God, how do we know what his commands are? There are hundreds of different religious traditions and denominations in the world, with sharply conflicting views on almost any ethical issue one would care to name. And most of them say that these views can't be proven and have to be taken on faith. When people say they're following the will of God, all they really mean is that they've chosen to obey the human beings whom they've been taught to believe can speak for God. The second problem was first stated by the philosopher Plato over 2,000 years ago in his book, The Euthyphro. Plato's question is this: does God command something because it is good, or is it good because God commands it? If we choose the first option, we're saying that there's a moral standard above God, and that God is just telling us what it is. This presents a problem in explaining what this standard is and where it comes from. And of course, an atheist could say that if this is true, God isn't needed for morality at all. Let's just appeal to the moral standard directly and cut out the middleman. However, the second option is worse. If something is good simply because God commands it, and for no other reason, then you're saying that morality is determined solely by God's whim. So far, God has declared justice and mercy and such things to be good, but tomorrow he might change his mind and declare rape, torture, and genocide to be good. After all, if there's no higher standard that constrains him, that's the same as saying there's no reason why he would choose one thing and not another. This is would make religious moral standards basically arbitrary, as I imagine here. And if you've ever read the Bible, you know that these aren't purely hypothetical examples. There are verses scattered throughout the world's holy texts where God commands his chosen people to commit terrible atrocities. Take the Old Testament story of the binding of Isaac. In it, God tells Abraham to offer his only son as a human sacrifice, as a test of faith. Abraham is willing to do it and gets as far as tying his son to the altar and lifting the knife to strike before an angel intervenes to stop him at the last second. That the sacrifice wasn't actually carried out doesn't change the moral revulsion we should feel at this episode. What kind of God would demand that a man prove his obedience by murdering his only son? And more so, what kind of man would obey a command like that? Abraham has been held up as an archetype of faith by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike. But is this really the sort of behavior that we should strive to emulate? The willingness to kill in God's name? Another bloody biblical story is the conquest of Palestine. I'm sure you all know the story of the Exodus, repeatedly depicted in Hollywood movies. How the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, how Moses arose to lead them, how 10 terrible plagues supposedly convinced the Pharaoh to let them go, and how the Jews wandered in the desert until they found the promised land that God had given them as part of his covenant. But what usually gets left out of this story is that when the Israelites arrived at the promised land, it wasn't empty. There were whole nations of people already living there, people who had no intention of leaving. To solve this problem, God tells his chosen tribe to stage a massive invasion, burning all the cities and slaughtering all the people whose only fault was being born in a country that God had promised to someone else. as the book of Deuteronomy puts it. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. God specifically identifies groups of people by nationality and orders the Israelites to kill all of them, men, women, and children, leaving no one alive. This is the definition of genocide, the deliberate and targeted eradication of a people. The best archaeological evidence shows that the Exodus and the conquest probably never happened, at least not exactly the way the Bible depicts them. They were patriotic myths, origin stories, invented by later generations of priests and scribes to justify campaigns of nationalistic conquest. But that doesn't change the horror of the story, or the condemnation we should rightfully levy on those who hold it up as an example to be admired. Countless real-life crusaders, holy warriors, jihadists, and inquisitors have taken their inspiration from bloody stories like these. The arbitrariness of this moral system, the idea that morality is whatever God says it is, not whatever is best for human beings, makes it hugely destructive to life and well-being. Religious believers may claim that only God's absolute moral strictures can prevent humans from committing evil deeds, but the fact is that virtually every single person or group that has ever believed in God is firmly convinced that God is on their side and will justify what they do. The belief in divine sanction can be and has been used as an excuse to commit almost every crime imaginable. Whether it's the Islamic terrorists whose rallying cry is Allah Akbar, God is greatest, the medieval European crusaders whose battle cry was said to be Deus Vult, Latin for God wills it, or the American slaveholders whose motto was Deo Vindice, God is our vindicator. All these sayings, in all these different languages, express the same evil and anti-humanistic idea that God is on our side and wants us to commit violence against our fellow human beings. But even when divine command morality doesn't lead to outright evil, it can have other negative consequences. One of these is that it drains the urgency from efforts to do good in this world, causing apathy in the face of human suffering. After all, if there's an afterlife where justice will be served and everyone will ultimately get what they deserve, why bother instituting any sort of earthly justice? Why imprison a criminal if he'll eventually get what's coming to him anyway? Why try to help the poor or the disadvantaged if they'll be rewarded later for their suffering now? The supposed inescapability of divine justice renders human justice superfluous. One unfortunate example of this was Mother Teresa, who was hailed as a friend of the desperately poor in India and all over the world. But in reality, despite the millions of dollars in donations she accepted, her clinics were kept in rudimentary and unsanitary condition. As former volunteers testified, they gave almost no real care at all. They gave no painkillers stronger than aspirin to badly suffering people. They sent no one to real hospitals, even people having genuine medical emergencies who could have been saved. This was deliberate, as Mother Teresa herself repeatedly explained to anyone willing to listen to what she was actually saying, because in her view, the suffering of poor people was beautiful and greatly improved the world. She believed it was a blessing for people to suffer as Jesus Christ suffered, and she was eager for as many people to receive that blessing as possible. One slide. Another of these negative consequences is that religious morality accustoms people to obeying authority. Rather than thinking for themselves, rationally debating the best course of action, and coming to their own conclusions, it keeps them at the level of moral children who only know how to do as they're told. And many religious apologists admit that this is their goal. One example was the famous writer C.S. Lewis, who said in one of his apologetics books that obedience was, quote, intrinsically good. In other words, It's a good habit for people to get used to doing as they're told, no matter what they're being told to do or who's telling them to do it. From the other side of the Catholic-Protestant divide, the Vatican has taken the same position. In 1906, Pope Pius X issued a papal decree in which he said that in the priesthood rests the necessary right and authority for directing all members of society toward whatever goals they think best, whereas the one duty of lay people is to allow themselves to be led and like a docile flock to follow the pastors. This idea isn't unique to Christianity either. In one of his essays, Richard Dawkins quoted a Jewish rabbi who explained that the kosher dietary laws are, quote, divine ordinances without reason given, and that this is, again, quote, 100% the point, because if there was a good reason for those rules, it would be easy to obey them. Instead, because they're arbitrary and because they're irrational, they help us develop the habit of doing as we're told. This uncannily resembles a piece of parenting advice from Stephen Colbert, who wrote in one of his books that arbitrary rules teach kids discipline. If every rule made sense, they wouldn't be learning respect for authority, they'd be learning logic. However, my biggest objection to divine command morality is that it offers no better reason to behave than the promise of reward and the threat of punishment. In other words, a carrot and a stick. It assumes that people can't ever be trusted to behave morally on their own, that we have to be constantly chastised by a supernatural lawgiver to keep us in line. The harmful repercussions of this low view of human nature should be obvious. Rather than encourage us to seek the best option through reason and empathy, it promotes dogmatism and intolerance of differing opinions, because if morality is reinforced through punishment, then people who want to change the rules must be bad people who want you to get hurt. Rather than encouraging people to learn discipline and self-control, it teaches that we're sinners, incapable of controlling ourselves, thus actually encouraging immoral behavior. Just ask any of the TV preachers who've been caught committing the same acts they preach against every week. And worst of all, it denies the value of being good for its own sake that should be at the heart of any ethical system. After all, if a person's fear of divine smiting is the only thing stopping him from doing evil to everyone around him, then that person isn't really very moral at all, is he? To those who've been indoctrinated with the belief that it's impossible to be good without religion, the idea of an atheist with a moral code is a strange, disorienting concept, like seeing someone standing on air with no visible means of support. They think that if they were in that position, they'd come tumbling down, and they can't understand why we don't. If you've ever debated this online, or in person, you may even have encountered, as I have, the bizarre spectacle of religious evangelists who actually argue with us, telling us that as atheists, we should have no reason to care about right or wrong. In short, trying to persuade us to be more evil. Of course, there's no real reason why an atheist can't be a moral person. Our motivations are clear enough. We care about this world and this life, since it's the only one we have. This makes it all the more urgent, all the more important that we help the needy, that we deliver justice to wrongdoers, that we reward or punish people as their conduct deserves. Because if we don't do it, no one else will. It's all up to us. And while that's a huge and terrifying responsibility, it's also liberating, knowing that we're the ones in control of our own minds, our own lives, our own destinies, that our choices really matter, that the future is in our hands, and that we can shape the world as we see fit. That's the hope and the promise of atheist morality. Any questions?